Welcome to today's CEF public lecture. Thanks everyone for joining, and especially thank you very much to our speaker, Bethelhem, Legesse, Debela, for accepting our invitation to present the work in our public lecture series. Today's presentation is entitled Links Between Maternal Employment and Child Nutrition in Rural Tanzania. I think this is very timely for the International Women's Day, which was yesterday. Our speaker today, Bethelhem Legesse Debela, is a postdoctoral researcher at the Chair of International Food Economics and Rural Development at University of Göttingen. Bethelhem holds a Bachelor in Economics from Mekelle University in Ethiopia and a Master's in Development and Natural Resource Economics from the Norwegian University of Life Science in Oslo, where she also completed her PhD work on attaining secure rural livelihoods, the role of household strategies and public interventions. In between, Bethelhem was working with CIMMYT and has been a visiting scholar of Purdue University. And of course, not to forget, Bethelhem has won a prestigious DFG individual research grant, which took off in January 2021. Today, and this was also a personal request, Bethelhem presents her work on gender issues in rural Africa, which was previously published in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm going to talk about the links between maternal employment and child nutrition in rural Tanzania. This is a joint work with Dr. Esther Gerke and Professor Martin Keim. So, my presentation has three parts. First, I'm going to talk about the paper on maternal employment and child nutrition in rural Tanzania. And then I'm going to briefly discuss about further research that we undertook together with my colleagues on topics related to women's time use and labor supply. And then finally, I will give a general takeaway messages. So I'll start with the paper on the links between maternal employment and child nutrition in rural Tanzania. So in many low and middle income countries, child undernutrition remains a prevalent development challenge. One of the contributing factors for high child mortality, morbidity, impaired physical and cognitive development is nutritional deficiency during early childhood. So recently, there have been increased development efforts to address the problem of child undernutrition. However, the rates of child undernutrition continues to be high, and this rate is high, especially when it is measured in terms of child stunting. So stunting is a condition when a child has low height for his or her age compared to a healthy population of children with the same age and gender. Since stunting affects children's long-term development, it has a long-term health implication, and therefore reducing child stunting is a global health priority. And in this respect, there have been questions as to what types of intervention can help address the problem of child undernutrition. So one intervention point is women empowerment. And research have shown that women empowerment is positively associated with child nutritional outcome. And many of the interventions that aim at female empowerment try to improve women's access to productive resources and also employment. So let's look at the employment aspect. Here, when women are employed, household income increases, and also the share of income controlled by women increases, and this in a way increases the decision-making power of women, and research show there is a positive relationship between women's decision-making power and child nutritional status. On the other hand, there are other dimensions beyond the income aspect that might affect the link between employment and child nutritional status. So that means there are important aspects that we need to consider in order to understand the link between women's employment and child nutritional status. So in relation to this, some important aspects to consider. First, labor burden among women is high. especially in rural areas of developing countries. Particularly, they are involved in family farm activities, child nutrition, and also household work. And if additional employment opportunities exist in the form of off-farm activity, this further adds to their workload. And this may negatively affect the nutritional status of children as it reduces the time available for childcare. So similarly, trade-offs might also exist if interventions, particularly on on-farm activities, involve additional workload for women. So one of the popular interventions is homestead gardens that aim at improving smallholder nutrition by increasing vegetable consumption. However, this could have a trade-off because mainly homestead gardens are managed by women, and this may reduce the time available for childcare. So it is important to understand the underlying mechanisms behind the link between employment, women employment, and child nutritional status. And in this particular paper, we focus on mother and child relationship and try to understand the underlying mechanism behind the link between maternal employment and child nutritional status. So we identify three main underlying mechanisms. The first one is the income effect, the bargaining power effect, and the time reallocation effect. So the income effect comes from the monetary benefit that women get from their employment, and this allows them to spend on nutrition enhancing expenditures, particularly useful for children. So this is expected to have a positive implication for children's nutritional outcome. And then the bargaining effect comes from income control by women. And if mothers have their own income source and share part of their income, then this increases their decision-making power. And as I've already mentioned, higher decision-making power among women and among mothers is positively associated with child nutritional status. So the above two mechanisms, the income effect and the bargaining power effect, are expected to result in a positive link with nutrition, whereas the time reallocation mechanism is expected to have a negative relationship. So the time aspect is important because maternal time is important for child nutrition. And if the mother works, then it reduces the time available for childcare. And this might have a negative implication for nutritional status. Now, the question is, what is the net effect? We have identified three mechanisms: the income effect, the bargaining power effect, and the time reallocation effect. And the results depend on which of these mechanisms dominate. So if the income effect and the bargaining power effect dominate, we expect a positive relationship between maternal employment and child nutrition. And if the time reallocation mechanism dominates, then we expect a negative relationship between maternal employment and child nutrition. So our objective in this paper is to investigate the association between maternal employment and child nutritional status, and we focus on off-farm employment and on-farm employment among mothers. So we classify these two because we expect the underlying mechanisms to result in different effect on nutritional status. And we are particularly interested in the time allocation effect, and therefore we investigate whether the effect differs depending on the amount of time the mother spends in either the off-farm work or the on-farm work. So to answer our research questions, we use 3 rounds of LSMS data from the World Bank from Tanzania. We use the 2008, 2010, and 2012 data. And as I mentioned earlier, we are interested to differentiate between off-farm and on-farm employment, and therefore we focus only on the rural sample. And we match children with their respective mothers, and we focus only on children below the age of 5. And we ended up with 5,096 observations. So 2 most important variables for this particular analysis is maternal time allocation and child nutritional measures. So as a measure of child nutrition, we use HAZ Z-score, and we constructed based on WHO's growth standard. And the Z-score basically represents the standard deviation compared to the median of the reference population. Basically, if a child has HAZ score below -2, then the child is categorized as stunted. In other words, the child is short, too short for his or her age compared to a healthy child with the same age and gender. So why do we choose HAZ score? It is important because HAZ score represents or reflects long-term nutritional status of children, and this can be influenced by the dietary and health conditions during early childhood. And the HAZ score allows us to capture the child's biological responses to nutrition and health condition, and this can be affected by maternal labor supply. So in this paper, we measure maternal labor supply in two ways. One is a binary variable, where we just measure whether the mother works or not in off-farm and on-farm. And then we measure the employment intensity by using the number of hours the mother spends in wage work or on-farm work during 7 days prior to the survey. So we use 7-day recall in this case. So this is the description of our data with nutritional status. And as we can see here, the average HAZ score is -1.53. And as we can see, the rates of stunting is 45% in 2008 and declines to 37% in 2010 and 2012. And as we can see from these rates of stunting, this is relatively high, and it shows that child undernutrition, chronic child undernutrition, is widespread in rural Tanzania, particularly for this sample. So let's look at the employment status of mothers in our sample. So as you can see here, around 11% of mothers are employed in the off-farm sector, whereas 70% work on-farm. And when we look at the hours spent, mothers spend on average 2.8 hours per week in off-farm work and 18.8 hours per week on agricultural work. So when we see these hours over time, we don't see much of a variation between the different survey years. And when we checked our data also, their employment status does not change over time. So the majority of the mothers do not change their employment status. So we empirically test the relationship between maternal employment and child nutritional status by using panel data regression approaches, where I'm not going to go deeper into the method part, but we try to estimate HAZ score as a function of the labor supply. And as I mentioned earlier, labor supply is measured in terms of binary and also continuous variable. So we are interested to examine if labor intensity or maternal employment intensity matters HAZ score. And in order to check that, we add polynomial, a higher degree polynomial for maternal hours. And we use mother fixed effect. And in order to control for time invariant unobserved heterogeneity, we use Mundlach estimator or the pseudo fixed effect approach. So prior to our regression analysis, we examined the bivariate relationship between maternal employment and child linear growth. So here we present the kernel density plot for HAZ score classified among mothers who work off-farm and mothers who do not work off-farm. So as we can see from this plot, child HAZ score is systematically higher if the mother does not work, as we can see from this plot. And a similar pattern is also observed for maternal on-farm participation. As we can see here, the distribution is shifted to the right for children living with non-working mothers in agriculture. But the two figures that we just saw are simply descriptive, and we don't control for other compounding factors like child characteristics and maternal characteristics and also household characteristics. But in our regression approaches, we control for these confounding factors and try to see the relationship between maternal employment and child nutritional status. So coming to our regression output, here we see the link between maternal employment in off-farm and Heterogeneity score. And as we see from this table, there is a negative association between maternal off-farm employment and Heterogeneity score. This is when we look at the dummy variable. And then when we look at the hours, we see an interesting result where we have a non-linear relationship between maternal hours and Heterogeneity score. So at low level of hours that the mother spends in off-farm work, there is a negative relationship between maternal employment and child nutrition. And then at moderate hours worked, then the relationship turns positive, as we can see for the square term. And then at very high hours spent on off-farm activity, then we see a negative relationship. So this is the nonlinear relationship that I just described. And we can see this in this plot where we have the predicted child Heterogeneity score based on the above regression. So this is exactly what I just described. And at the beginning, at lower time spent in off-farm work, Heterogeneity score becomes lower. And then if the mother works approximately more than 12 hours, then it starts to increase and then it turns positive. I mean, the association turns positive. And then if the mother works more than 55 hours per week, and then it starts to decline and the relationship becomes negative. So what we see from here is that the underlying mechanism is changing relevance depending on how much time the mother spends working off-farm. So as I mentioned earlier, for the bargaining effect and for the income effect, we expect a positive relationship. And for the time reallocation mechanism, we expected a negative relationship. So that means depending on how much time the mother spends, this relationship changes. Looking at the relationship between maternal on-farm and on-farm and child nutrition, we don't see a significant association between maternal on-farm work and child nutritional status. This is observed in this regression output where we don't see a significant relationship between on-farm work and Heterogeneity score. So we see this both for the dummy variable and also for the hours, we don't see any significant result. And when we control for off-farm work and on-farm work in the same regression, the finding for the off-farm still remains consistent, but the on-farm work continues to be statistically insignificant. So that means maternal on-farm work does not affect child nutrition considerably. So the question is, which of the underlying mechanisms matter for the relationship between maternal off-farm employment and child nutrition? We discussed about the underlying mechanisms earlier, and now we are interested to see which of the underlying mechanisms matter for this relationship. Our results show that there is a negative association at low and very high amount of time spent in off-farm work. And this means that the time reallocation mechanism matter for this negative relationship. And then the income mechanism is expected to have a positive relationship. And in order to see if the income effect matters, we add household consumption expenditure in our regression and try to see if our finding is sensitive or if our finding changes. And when we do that, we don't see any change, which means that the income effect does not seem to play a role for the relationship between maternal employment and child nutrition. So what we conclude from here is that the main driver for the link between maternal off-farm employment and child nutrition is the time reallocation mechanism. But then this depends on whether there is a labor substitution within the household. If the mother works and if other household members substitute for the mother, then this is expected to offset the negative relationship. So we checked this by including labor contribution by the father and other household members, and we found that our result does not change and the nonlinear relationship still continues to be there. So this means that the substitution effect is not sufficient enough to offset the negative relationship between maternal employment and height for age discord. So as you can see from this table, once we control for the income effect and also for the labor contribution, we see that the nonlinear relationship still remains between off-farm hours and height for age discord. What is interesting is that the positive relationship still continues to be there, even after controlling for the income effect. And this means that this is caused by the bargaining power effect. So we expected a positive relationship if there is a bargaining power effect and the income effect. And once we control for the income effect, we still see a positive relationship. That means this is caused by the bargaining effect. And then we conclude that the negative association is mainly driven by the time reallocation mechanism, which means that if the mother reallocates her time to off-farm work, then this negatively affects the nutritional status of children. So next, we try to see if there is heterogeneity in the links between maternal employment and child nutrition, first by classifying our sample based on age group. So we try to see whether the implication of maternal employment varies by age group. And here we classify children below 2 years and children above 2 years. And our finding shows that the observed effect between maternal off-farm employment and child nutrition is more visible for older children, for children between 2 and 4 years, and not for younger children. So this is indicative of the long-term nature of height for age discord. As I mentioned earlier, height for age discord reflects long-term nutrition outcome. And therefore, what we see from here is that child nutritional status during early childhood are fully reflected later in life, and this may be affected by maternal labor supply. So this is what we are seeing in this result. Next, we subdivided our sample by gender in order to see if there is any parental preferences for girls and boys, and we find a nonlinear relationship only for girls and not for boys. So this is interesting because we only see the positive relationship for girls and not for boys, which means that girls are benefiting from the bargaining power effect from the mothers. And interestingly, if the mother spends very high amount of time working off-farm, there is a negative and significant relationship for both girls and boys, as we can see from this. And this implies that time constraint among mothers have a negative implication on child nutritional status, regardless of the gender of the child. So time constraint affects both girls and boys. So we did a couple of robustness check to see if our results are consistent. The first is we used alternative measures of maternal employment. As I mentioned earlier, we used 7-day recall for maternal time allocation, and this may be affected by seasonality. Of course, it is more accurate because it has short recall period, but it may be affected by seasonality, and therefore we now use a different variable for the off-farm work, we use the average weekly number of hours that the mother worked off-farm over the past 12-month period. And for the on-farm activities, we use labor days spent by the mother in on-farm activities during the past 12 months. And in both cases, our results remain the same and our findings are consistent. And then the other robustness check is by using only children that appeared at least twice in the survey round. We have 3 survey rounds, and we try to keep only children that are appearing at least twice in the survey rounds. This allows us to exclude children that do not have any within variation. And again, our findings are consistent. And when we use fixed effects and random effects estimator, our results are also consistent. So when we look at different robustness analysis, our findings, particularly the nonlinear relationship, remains, which means that our results are strong. So in general, we find that maternal participation in off-farm employment is negatively associated with child nutritional outcome measured in terms of HAZ score. And when we consider the intensity of the work, the association varies depending on the amount of time the mother spends in off-farm activities. And this is shown by our nonlinear relationship. And we find that the income mechanism plays less role, and the bargaining power effect plays a role for the relationship between maternal employment and child nutrition. And this is observed at moderate hours spent in off-farm work, and girls benefiting more than boys from maternal off-farm employment. And looking at the link between maternal on-farm work and child nutritional outcome, as I mentioned earlier, we don't see statistically significant association between these two, and this could be for 2 reasons. First, on-farm agricultural activities are easier to combine with childcare because mainly on-farm agricultural close to the homestead, and it is easier to combine with childcare. And that means the negative time reallocation mechanism plays less role, or it is less relevant in this case. And the other is the bargaining power. The gain from the bargaining power may be relatively smaller for agricultural work compared to off-farm activities. So in conclusion, our results suggest that there can be trade-offs between child nutrition and women empowerment goals. And in some circumstances, there could be positive synergies between child nutrition and women empowerment. But then it is important to understand the underlying mechanisms and also the nonlinear relationship between these two in order to design an appropriate development intervention. Based on our findings, we draw few policy implications. The first is that interventions that aim at improving smallholder livelihoods should incorporate gender-sensitive components. And when incorporating these gender-sensitive components, it's important to take into account of maternal time constraint and in general, women's time constraint. Another intervention point could be to improve women's access to profitable self-employed activities. And this is important because women can combine income-generating activity with childcare, and therefore this strengthens the bargaining power effect and also the income effect. So future research in this area could examine this complex relationship between maternal employment and child nutrition in different geographical contexts and also cultural contexts, and maybe using more precise time allocation data could improve the data quality. For example, by using digital time recording devices, this allows to get a better data. So this is the end of the discussion for the paper on maternal employment and child nutrition in rural Tanzania. And next, I'm going to discuss about further research that we undertook together with my colleagues on related topics. And the findings from the earlier paper has also implication on these papers. So the first one is effects of contract farming on diets and nutrition in Ghana. And in this paper, I'm just going to give a brief description of our findings. So here we examine the effect of contract farming on dietary diversity and child nutritional status. We used survey data from Ghana, and we looked at two types of contract farming schemes. And we have the marketing scheme and also the resource providing scheme. And we find that contract farming in general improved smallholder nutrition, but then the effect varied by contract type. And we looked at the underlying mechanisms, and these two have different implications on gender roles and labor use. And particularly, both type of contracts result in female labor saving. And the difference is that how they use the saved labor. And for the marketing contract, they are allocated to off-farm work. And for the resource providing contract, they are allocated for on-farm work. And our findings showed that higher nutritional benefit is observed for the resource providing contract. And this may be related to the off-farm participation by females from the marketing contract. And interestingly, we found that contracting female farmers had a larger positive child nutritional benefit. And this shows the bargaining power effect that children benefiting from females being contracted and females controlling the income from contract farming. So another research is on oil palm cultivation and gender roles in Indonesia. And here also, we try to examine if oil palm cultivation affects time allocation of males and females and also women's decision-making power. And we found that as the share of farm area under oil palm increases, then women spend much more time in household work and less time in farming and more time in leisure. And oil palm cultivation decreased women's decision-making power. So in general, time use and gender roles may be affected due to interventions involving women employment and cash crop production that includes contract farming. And such kind of interventions should consider the time constraints among women in general, and also the changing gender roles within the households, because there could be trade-offs on diets and also child nutritional outcomes, as well as women's decision-making power. Thank you very much.